The Money Series was devised as a tool for educating the public on financial issues, and we wanted it to be a broad-based program. So we've done various programs over the past 5 months. We talked about annuities. I gave that talk, and it was, the unique spin on that was it was about a product that normally is sold to people, and normally people learn about it through someone who's selling that product. And so I don't sell annuities, and I thought that would be a pretty good topic to introduce to the public without any commercial messaging. We had a speaker, an attorney, Dan Penning, talk about cottage law and how to preserve your family cottage throughout the generations, which was a really fantastic program. We had Phil Ellis from the Regional Foundation talk about legacy giving and how everybody can really have a legacy throughout their lifetime of philanthropic giving. And we had a really wonderful program with that as well. And all of these programs are available on our website, which is frontstreetfoundation.org. This is a nonprofit organization, and all of the full programs are available. If you go onto the website, you can actually watch these things and pass them along to people who were not able to attend. And I think that that's really part of the mission of having financial education spread throughout the region. And so I would really encourage you to go onto the website. I want to tell you just a little bit about the actual Front Street Foundation, which is the nonprofit element of which the Money Series is part. It is a nonprofit, as I mentioned, and it's done in cooperation with some really important partners, collaborators in a sense. The Traverse Area District Library has been wonderful to allow us to come here and give these talks in such a great room and have it be part of the community center. And the library represents, I think, a place for education, and it's a safe place for education. And the wonderful thing is they've made the investments necessary to allow it to be recorded the way that it has been. So the Traverse Area District Library is a great partner. In addition, we're taking these programs, some of them that are really geared towards a constituency that tends to be older, and we're mirroring these programs over at the Grand Traverse County Senior Center Network off of Front Street. And so we've done programs also, the same programs here, we go and mirror the program about a week later at the Senior Center. And that's been really quite enjoyable to go over to that community and share with them things like that annuity program, for example. And then finally, the last partner is Up North Media themselves. Up North Media allows us to be producers of this program and submit these programs on air, and they run these programs a few times a week, constantly getting a new cycle of programs as we do our Money Series monthly. And so far they've had 3 programs in the last 4 months that they've been cycling through, and we're going to be adding more throughout the year. This program here with the Traverse Area District Library was a pilot program for 6 months, and we're now getting ready to schedule the programs throughout the rest of the spring through June. We'll always take the summer off because I think that people need to take some time off. So you should expect about 10 programs a year. So we'd love to have you come back and learn more and spread the word. I'm going to go do a little pitch for a couple of different programs coming up. Diane Kuhn-Huff from Stephen & Anderson is an attorney in town who I've known for some years. And specifically, my experience with her was related to Medicaid planning. And she has a specialty in that area, but she also does broader legal work. And she's going to be speaking on estate planning, and the title of it is Maintaining Choices as You Age. So it's going to be a program that we're also going to do at the Senior Center for that group of people too. For that, estate planning is a somewhat complex topic. It covers multiple generations, multiple age demographics. And I think Diane really has a specialty in estate planning for those who are aging. And so that's going to be a wonderful program. And it's going to be on January 18th, 2017 here, always Wednesday nights, about once a month. Except for January, we're going to do a second program. Scheduled one the week before that on January 11th. And I'm bringing back a topic that I spoke about last year when rule changes happened with Social Security. I decided that really once a year there should be somebody in the community talking about Social Security, because it's such an important element, I think, of a retirement plan, is understanding the nuances, the ins and outs of Social Security planning. And so I'm going to be giving that talk. I may be inviting some other people to come and add some value as well during that talk. So we're still doing some scheduling on that front. So I'd love to have you come to that. And with that, I want to introduce the first half of this program. Greg Luyt here is an attorney in town with Bowerman, Bowden, Ford, Clulo, and Luyt. He's a partner with the firm. He's going to tell you more about his background, because I think that, as I said last month, I think people really know themselves best and can give you a little bit more of a nuanced version of their history. But I've known Greg for years and years and years, and I've known him on a professional level. I've known him on a personal level, and I'm just really, really happy to have Greg here with us today.
Thanks, Jason. You're welcome. Well, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. It's the weather's a little bit dicey out there, I know. So thanks all for being here.
I'm going to give you a little tool here. This is for one of our audience members.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right, great. As Jason said, I practice law here in Traverse City. Our firm was founded by our senior partner, Gary Bowerman, in 1976. So we've been in this community for 40 years. I've been here for about 15 years. Practiced in Pittsburgh before I came to Traverse City. Primarily, our firm and my practice in particular, we represent individuals and entrepreneurial business owners. So a broad range of matters, business, real estate. A substantial portion of my practice is focused on estate planning, which is what I'm going to be talking about tonight. The topic tonight is a sort of a year-end tips and planning. And year-end is a time where people are making New Year's resolutions. They're taking stock of various parts of their lives. Estate planning, in my experience, if you have a plan, it might be something that you did at one time, you put in a drawer and haven't thought about much since then. And there are a number of things that are good to revisit on an annual basis, or at least periodically, to make sure that your estate plan fits with your life, that circumstances haven't changed in a way that you want to make some changes to it, and that it's up to date with current law, and with assets that you own and all those sorts of things. And one of the things that I do a lot of in my practice is estate and trust administration, which is the process of administering assets and affairs when somebody's passed away. And unfortunately, all too often, you find situations where there are things that weren't caught before someone's passed away and can do something about it. So tonight is kind of a personal inventory related to your estate plan. I wanted to say a couple things before we launch into it. One is that this is intended to be a very high level and brisk walk through a number of these concepts. And so these are things that are just want to raise as potential issues that you can talk about with your attorney and with your family. But we're going to be moving pretty quick. Certainly, as Jason said, we'll be available to answer questions after the program. But you know, there's no one size fits all for any estate plan. It is, every situation's unique, and so you know, your own situation has to be analyzed, obviously with your own personal circumstances in mind. So the other thing I wanted to say too is that I understand that there's probably a wide disparity in the audience tonight in terms of what you may have currently in place, from no plan at all to a very complex plan with multiple trusts and different other estate planning tools. What I hope to do tonight is talk about things that are universally applicable regardless of the kind of plan that you may have, because there are lots of things that apply no matter what. So the first thing to think about is, do you have a plan at all? And when was it drafted? Now, a plan, what is a plan? It is, it could encompass trusts, it could encompass wills, it could encompass powers of attorney. If you don't have a plan, what I will tell you is that in this day and age, it is not necessary to have an overly complex plan, but it is a good idea to have at least something in place for a few reasons. One, it provides direction to your family. It can save a lot of cost and a lot of uncertainty in the long run if your plan is actually documented properly. So if you don't have a plan, you want to think about putting one in place. If you do, you want to think about when was it put in place and does it still meet the goals and objectives and your personal circumstances at the time that you put it in place. So one of the things you want to look at is that overall structure of the plan. Do you need a trust? Why do people have trust as a part of their estate plan? There's a number of reasons that they would do that, but primarily I think there are three. One is estate tax avoidance. It is a means for allowing you to avoid the estate tax. That applies to less and less people, actually, as time has gone on. The current estate tax exemption amount, meaning the amount of total assets that you would have, that you can have without any of them being subject to tax, is about $5.5 million per individual. For a married couple, that then is up to $11 million, plus or minus. So for a lot of people, that doesn't necessarily have to be a consideration. And so if someone's telling you you need a trust to avoid estate tax and you're not in that kind of a net worth position, I'd be skeptical of that claim. Why another reason that people would have trusts in place is if there is someone in the family that either has special needs, or you're worried about, you've got younger kids, or you've got kids who have financial trouble, and rather than having money go to them with no strings attached, you want to create a mechanism where that money is protected and is doled out over time and with some controls on that. So there's do you have a trust? Do you need a trust? Another aspect of estate plans, and this is really more universal, is a will. A will is, if you don't have a trust, is the primary document for estate planning purposes that provides guidance for where your assets will go when you're gone. And finally, powers of attorney. There are two primary types of powers of attorney. One for healthcare decisions, if you're incapacitated and can't make those decisions yourself, and then one for financial decisions. And those are documents that I would say are a good idea for everybody. Because if those aren't in place, there can be uncertainty about who's making those kind of decisions, and that can create problems in terms of getting access to funds that you might need as if you're incapacitated, and certainly healthcare decisions, end-of-life decisions. Things that you may want to think about in terms of updating your estate plan is, have there been changes of the law since you last amended those documents? Now, there are lots of things that happen from time to time. We talked about estate tax exemption amounts. Those amounts a number of years ago were less than $1 million. And so that created a lot more trust planning for people, a lot more complicated estate plans, because there were a lot more people who were trying to avoid estate tax. As that estate tax exemption amount has gone up, it has made those plans maybe less necessary. There have been lots of changes to healthcare privacy laws as another example, and those healthcare powers of attorney I was mentioning before. There's some language that if you haven't had one of those updated in a while, you'll want to make sure it fits with current law, so that there's no question or problem with your decision makers using those documents to help you make decisions. Some other matters to inventory in your estate plan is those decision makers, and we've got primarily three different categories here. If you do have a trust, then the likelihood is that you are the trustee of your trust, and as long as you are alive and competent, then you're making all the decisions related to your trust. But what happens if you become incapacitated or you pass away and we're into an administration phase? Your trust probably names successor trustees. And that's one thing that has a tendency to change over time, particularly if it's an individual and maybe it's not a spouse, or your spouse has passed away. The question is, who, if you're not there, is going to make those decisions? Relationships change, circumstances change, maybe you've relocated. If your kids are designated as successor trustees, has something, if things happen in their life or in your relationship with them. Another thing to think about is a decision as between naming an individual successor trustee or naming a corporate trustee, and that can be, say, a bank trust department. There are some trust companies that will do that. Again, every family is different, right? Some families are very harmonious, everybody gets along, everything is going to be equal, it's all going to be fine. Other families are not like that. There can be emotional heartbreak that is associated with, well, mom appointed you and not me to this decision, to be this decision maker, and she liked you better than she liked me, and that puts family members sometimes in an awkward position. For some people, a resolution of that issue or a way of assisting with that is to say, I'm just going to take it out of the family entirely, and we'll get an independent third party, and then there's no decision about, there's no sort of strife within the family about that decision. The next category of decision makers are what's called personal representatives. Sometimes those have been referred to as executors. That's under your will. So the successor trustee is the person who is handling matters for your trust. The personal representative is handling matters under the will. If you have a trust plan, and we're going to talk about funding here in a couple of minutes, if you have a trust plan and it's properly implemented, the will really shouldn't come into play at all. All of the assets should be in the trust, and there shouldn't be anything else to deal with. The will is really there to deal with assets that aren't in trust, either because you don't have a trust, or if for some reason there are assets that didn't get put into the trust during your lifetime. Same kinds of considerations that I talked about with successor trustees are also applicable to the personal representative decision, because it's very, very similar. And I would say the same thing about that financial power of attorney. Again, powers of attorney are the documents that are who makes decisions for you if you're incapacitated but you're still alive. And for financial decisions, similar considerations to the trustee and personal representative. For the healthcare power of attorney, this is the person who is going to make medical decisions. It's very often that we see that people will come in and say, my brother has a great head for financial decisions, he's very smart, I want him handling all of those financial decisions, but I don't want him anywhere near the doctors when they're deciding whether to pull the plug, right? And so having different agents in terms of being your powers of attorney or being trustees for financial matters, it's perfectly appropriate, fine. Again, it all depends on your personal situation. And these are all things, as I said, that tend to change over time because your relationships change and circumstances change. So it's a good idea to pull those documents out and say, who did we designate in these roles? How do we feel about those people? Or were they still the right people? Are there other people who would be a better fit for that? Another thing to look at is beneficiary matters. This is what happens to your stuff when you're gone. So for most people, primarily they're naming their children, and they name them equally. That is not always the case, and there may be other individuals that you want to benefit in some way. It doesn't have to be an equal share. It can be maybe just a gift of a certain amount of money or some specific property. But taking a look at what you've done and said, okay, given where my life is now and my relationships are now, is this how I want my assets to be divided when I'm gone? Another thing that people should always think about on a periodic basis is charitable giving. Is there some charitable institution that you may want to include in your estate plan? And again, those are things that people develop relationships with over time, and so those things can change over time. In terms of how your assets are actually distributed, one big question is, are there going to be no strings attached? Can your son take all of those assets, all of that money, and go to Vegas the minute you die and gamble it all away, or will it be held in trust? Are there specific items of property, family heirlooms, jewelry, things that have a particular value, real estate? Is there a family cottage that one member of your family has a particular attachment to or has spent more time there, and you want to make a specific distribution with regard to that kind of property? Do you want to do that? And then, or do you want to have a plan where you basically are saying to the trustee, liquidate everything, divide up the cash, and I don't really care what happens with those assets. The next sort of large category here to talk about is trust funding, and frankly, non-trust funding. Creating your plan documents, whether it be a trust plan or a plan without a trust, is really only part of the process. And this is the part that, frankly, many people miss. And this is the part that leads to trouble in the long run, because those documents are only as good as the implementation as it relates to the assets that you have. So it's critical to look at that, again, whether you have a trust or you don't, to ensure that your plan is implemented properly, and this is a big, avoidance of probate. Probate is a term that people hear a lot, and I find in my practice there is often not a full understanding of what that actually means. People know generally we should avoid it. What is it? It's the formal process of administration of a decedent's estate. And it applies to all assets that are owned by that person as the date of death. It is a court proceeding. Now, in Michigan, there are some different types, supervised and unsupervised. In other words, in a supervised administration, that typically can happen, for example, when there is some conflict. There is some competing claims, and you need the court to be involved and supervise the administration. And formal and informal, for many types of administrations, you can do an informal, unsupervised administration, which basically means there are some documents that you have to file with the court and some steps that the personal representative under the will has to take, but there isn't a big lengthy court proceeding involved, and you may never have to actually go to court. Having said that, any of these types of probate administrations are going to involve additional costs, including what's called an inventory fee. So you have to pay to the probate court a fee based on the value of the assets at the time of death. Your personal representative is likely going to at least consult with, if not hire an attorney to handle the process. It's a good idea to do that. And there can be some additional delays associated with administration. So it is something to be avoided and can be avoided relatively easily with good planning. How do you do it? If you have a trust, funding your trust is the way you do it. So creating a trust, you think of a trust, it's like a shell. It's like it's a bucket. And when you create it, it's empty. There's a document that you've created, but it's an empty bucket. And in order to fund it, you have to put your assets into that bucket. What does that mean? It means if you own a piece of real estate that's in your individual name, then you would actually execute a deed and record it at the Register of Deeds that transfers that property to the trust, and you'd name the trust as the owner of the property. If you have an investment account at Merrill Lynch or Schwab, that is a non-retirement account, but a basic investment account, you would actually put the trust name as the title holder on that account. So that's what I mean when I say funding the trust. There are other ways to structure ownership if you don't have a trust that will help you avoid probate. Banks now, almost uniformly for bank accounts, have what are called transfer on death designations that you can sign at the bank that says, this account is in my name while I am alive, but at my death, I want it to go to my children or whoever your beneficiary is. And that written designation will be honored and will act to transfer those assets without a probate proceeding. Beneficiary designations on things like life insurance, retirement accounts, these are actual beneficiary designation documents that you sign, you fill out, and you say, these are the people who should get these assets when I'm gone. Co-ownership, you can, another way of dealing with a bank account, for example, is you can put one of your kids on the account. There are risks associated with that. If that becomes partly their asset, so they can take the money out of it. They can, if they have financial trouble, their creditors can get access to it. So that's a risky business, but it is a way of doing it. I wanted to mention quickly ladybird deeds, because these are, this is also a term that you may or may not be familiar with, but it can be an effective way of dealing with real estate. And what it is actually was named after Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson. It was a way that Lyndon Johnson dealt with his property as a means of saying, keeping control over it, but saying it's not in my name. In practice, what that means here in Michigan is, let's say you want to implement this and your kids are ultimately going to be the ones who get the real estate. You would deed the property to your kids, but you would retain what's called a life estate, meaning you get to stay there for the rest of your life and have full control and possession of the property. And you also maintain what's called a general power of appointment, meaning that you can sell it, you can deed it back to yourself and take your kids off of it if you change your mind. So it's a way of retaining that kind of control. But what that does is automatically at your death, it goes to the people that you've designated, your kids in that example. So that doesn't require a trust. So that's something to consider. Automobiles, there is a way of doing a non-probate transfer at the Secretary of State, and so those are typically not an issue in terms of probate. So for purposes of your year-end inventory, my advice to you would be to do an inventory of all your assets and figure out how are they owned, how are they titled, and actually put your eyeballs on the pieces of paper. Pull out the deed, pull out the bank statement, pull out the account statement. I cannot tell you how many times people have come into the office and said, oh yeah, this is all in my trust. And then you actually get the pieces of paper and it's not. So it's a good idea to do that on a periodic basis. And make sure that the ownership of those assets is consistent with the plan that you put in place. So those are really the primary matters that I wanted to hit in terms of a year-end inventory for estate planning purposes. I really appreciate you guys coming out, and I'm going to turn it over to Jason now for the second half of the program.
Thanks a lot, Greg. I will also add one little personal anecdote. Thanks. Appreciate it. Greg not only looks like a lawyer, but in about a half an hour, he's going to look like a rock star because he's one heck of a guitar player in a band, and he's going to have a practice later tonight. So if you ever hear about his band, you should go hear it. So I'm going to flip through a couple slides here. Quick introduction to myself, and because this is kind of important, I want you to know that I'm an investment advisor. I write in the paper. You may have seen my name. You saw some of the topics that I'm writing about, and that's part of the reason that you heard about this program. What I'm not is a tax expert. I'm not a CPA. I actually know taxes really, really well, and I'm going to be talking exclusively about taxes. So when I talk about taxes and you learn about possible opportunities this year, I always suggest that you talk to a professional tax preparer and go through these things, because I wouldn't want to make you feel as if I've given you definitive tax advice. But it's going to be pretty close to accurate here, so get ready. I have a degree in math and a former actuary, and I'm a chartered financial analyst, and you'll notice I'm not a CPA. This whole back half of this program, and I'm going to talk about going through what Greg did, which is a whirlwind tour of estate planning in a half an hour. Really not doing it full justice, because he could talk for hours on it. I'm going to do the exact same thing when it comes to the tax changes that I believe we're about to see. And I believe we're about to see them either effective 2017, which could mean as soon as January 1st. That's going to take some pretty fast lawmaking in Washington, which we're not really used to, but we also aren't used to complete and total control with one party, as well as the White House. So there is a possibility that we could see some tax changes that they retroactively apply to January 1st, or it'll take place in 2018. If I were in their position and I had a particular plan, and I had that much control and I had the ability to do it, I probably would make it retroactive to January 1st, which means that there's some planning that you need to think about doing before the end of the year, which makes everything really, really quick. But it is what it is, so I'm going to teach you about it, and then you can decide what you want to do. I also will tell you that absolutely nobody knows the future, including me, believe it or not. But I'm going to pretend, for planning purposes, that this is going to be something that is retroactive to January 1st. And I'm going to do it because it's the conservative thing to do. If in fact it's 2018, most of the things I'm talking about are still going to be a beneficial thing for you to have thought about. If in fact they do retroactively apply the tax law changes to January 1st, this was your opportunity for the next 2 weeks to think about these things. So I'd rather be conservative and assume that January 1st, 2017 is the implementation of this. So I'm going to go through really, really quite quickly. The changes that are being contemplated are based on Paul Ryan in the House, is the Speaker of the House. He put together a plan that I believe the Republican Party has been, and his particular unit of the Republican Party has really developed a very detailed plan. I believe that if I were a fly on the wall, I think they have the bill written. I think it's pretty much set up. They've been talking about it for years and years and years, and it's ready to go. Okay, and so a lot of this stuff is coming from the Paul Ryan plan. That Paul Ryan plan, if you went and looked at President-elect Trump's plan when he was a candidate, it almost mirrored it identically. So there are a few little tweaks here and there. The tweaks, I think, were simply to make it look like it was a different plan. I mean, for political purposes. If you have the same exact plan, it looks like plagiarism. So they really coordinated. So a lot of this lines up with both the White House view of things as well as the House. The Senate, on the other hand, well, I won't talk about the Senate. I don't think they have a different view, is the point. So lower tax rates for some people and unchanged tax rates for others. I'm going to show you a picture. This is the picture that I really want to highlight. You'll see that under the current law, you have 7 different tax brackets. And those tax brackets kick in at certain types of income levels. And that's how we do our tax system in the United States. We have a sort of a graduated tier-based tax system. The more you make, the higher the tax rate. Okay? The new proposed plan under both Trump as well as the House is to consolidate it into 3 different tax brackets. So if you just take a look side to side, the 10% bracket becomes 12%. Well, that doesn't look like a lower tax rate for them. 15% becomes 12. Well, between the first $75,000 for a married couple, pretty much you could say it's the same, unchanged. 10 and 15 merge into 12. Looks about the same to me. The 25% bracket goes up all the way from $75,000 to $150,000. Well, that's still the 25% bracket. No change at all. So we're talking about the vast, vast, vast majority of American households making $150,000 and less. Really nothing's changing when it comes to the tax rate, okay? But you'll notice in these top 4 brackets, the 28, 33, 35, and 39.6, those become 25, 33, 33, and 33. So these last 2 brackets you see a significant decrease in tax rates. And that kicks in around $400,000. So, I don't know the numbers specifically, but I can pretty much tell you it's a percentile that may be in the top, 4 or 5% of all taxpayers. That's where they're going to see a very large decrease in tax rates. Okay, capital gains is another change. Lower capital gains tax for some, higher capital gains taxes for others. This was very unique, and if it passes, I think it's going to be an interesting thing for people to recognize. This is a similar look, but now we're talking about capital gains. So we're talking about things that you buy, like a stock, and then you later sell it, and it's at a greater price. So you made a gain. Okay, that's what it means by capital gains. And capital gains, and we're talking long-term capital gains. You buy something, you hold it for at least a year, and then you sell it. If you buy something and hold it for less than a year and make money, that's just ordinary income. The government doesn't say that it's different. But if you hold it for a year, they say, well, that was a long-term capital gain, and they tax it differently. Well, currently, and this came from George W. Bush and then was later extended by the Obama administration, we have a very, very special 0% tax rate for households that, for married couples, let's just talk about that, $75,000 of taxable income or less. If you have any gains at all that are long-term, the government doesn't tax it, the federal government. State does, but not the federal. 0. Well, that now becomes 6. So that bracket of people, 75,000 under, are actually going to see a bigger tax for capital gains than they did before. 15% is the next bracket. That's going to be 12.5. 15 is 12.5. 15, 16.5. 15, 16.5. They all look about the same to me. And then 20% tax rate for people who have income of above $400,000. That's going to go down to 16.5. So the big change here is that it's lower capital gains for some and actually higher for others. This is a quick review of the proposed changes. The proposal is that we're going to eliminate the estate tax. So Greg talked a lot about the estate tax avoidance through the trusts and how $5 million per person. For every individual, you have a $5 million exemption. If you're a married couple, you've got, it's 5.5, you've got 11 million as a couple. They're just going to want to get rid of the estate tax completely, and that there's been talk about getting rid of it. It's framed as the death tax in that lingo. So it really is something that the Republican Party has wanted to get rid of for a long, long time. And in fact, the Democratic Party took those levels that were once at $1 million and even lower, and they actually increased it or kept it at a high level in 2011, 2012 under the Obama administration. They put it at 11 million. This was not a one-party decision. This was almost a bipartisan effort to raise the levels. Well, now the move is to just get rid of it completely. I looked it up, and it affects about 5,000 filings a year actually have an estate tax to pay now. 5,000 out of, it's essentially 1 out of every 500 tax filings this affects. So we're talking about 0.2% of all taxpayers really are subject to the estate tax as it is now, and it will go to 0. Just to give you perspective, it raises about $17 billion a year of revenue out of a $3 trillion budget. So it's not even worth discussing, frankly, from an argumentative standpoint, because it's not about taxes. It's about something else, potentially. But it's affecting almost nobody. But they want to eliminate it, okay? No alternative minimum tax. Excuse me, the microphone is a little loud. No AMT. AMT is not something I'm going to get into deeply here, but if you're affected by it, it's probably because you have a lot of deductions and also a good amount of income, and the government wanted to create a separate system developed back in the 60s to actually collect taxes on households that were not paying taxes under the current the tax code back in the 60s. So they implemented a thing called the alternative minimum tax, and it started to capture taxes of tens of thousands of families that were super wealthy or weren't paying. Well, that AMT has been in place for all these years and has been slowly and slowly capturing more and more regular taxpayers, people making $150,000, $200,000, $250,000. These are not the people they originally targeted back in the 60s. And the AMT it comes in, they want to get rid of that. So that'll be a simplification. No such thing as the AMT anymore. There's a tax that the Obama administration put in place for the Affordable Care Act to raise more revenue to help pay for the Affordable Care Act. And it's a 3.8% tax on all forms of investment income. Once you hit big levels of income, you started to pay tax on your investment income. An extra tax, a surcharge, a 3.8% tax. That's going to be gone. So again, this is something that only affects a small sliver of taxpayers. 400,000, 500,000, that's the level at which you'd really worry about this. Well, you're not going to worry anymore if you make that much money. Lower corporate income tax, significantly lower. I should say from a percentage standpoint, currently corporations pay at a 35% tax rate. They're talking about bringing it all the way down to 15%. Maybe even 20, depending on the negotiation. So a significant reduction. And it's partly to try to compete with other tax entities out there or other countries that tax corporations at a lower rate. We don't want corporations leaving, and that's the discussion about it. And additionally, if you have a business that is in the form of an LLC or you own a business as an S Corp, a lot of your income passes right through to your ordinary tax return. That's how it works. But it's a corporation. They want to bring that tax for that form of income, a small business owner, they want to tax it at much lower levels than even what I was showing you before. So again, the tax changes are really benefiting those who make a lot of money and also those who own businesses. And I think we all have seen that during the campaign. This is really the plan, and now it's all in place to kind of put it into implementation. And then lastly, this one is really for the lower income earners, that they're going to have a bigger child tax benefits of a couple different forms. So if you have kids, you're going to get a little bit of a tax credit. And that's only if you don't make much more than $150,000, at which point the credits start to go away. Okay. Now, this is the big change, and this is really what I wanted to do this talk about, and that's the reason I'm calling it year-end planning, is because we're coming up on the end of the year, and there are some things that people need to think about in light of this change. The proposals, pretty much universally, that I've seen and read about are, the proposal is to eliminate what's called personal exemptions. Probably most of you don't look at your tax return as closely as a person like me does, because I'm addicted to numbers. And I will tell you, there's a second page of your 1040. It's your second page of your tax return. There are two lines. There's one that says personal exemptions, and it basically is they take a look at your income and they give you a break on your income just because you're a living, breathing human being. That's what you get, a personal exemption. It's bizarre when you think about it. They take $4,000 off of your taxable income because you're alive. And if you have like 3 kids and a spouse, now all of a sudden you have 4 of those or 5 of those, and you have, like my family, and you have $20,000 knocked off of your income, just like that. If you're really making a lot of money, incidentally, they start to phase that out. Well, I didn't write it on here, but guess what? That phase out of the personal exemptions is eliminated for people making a lot of money. So they're going to, but they're eliminating personal exemptions completely. So the second thing is no itemized deductions. Currently, right now, about 30% of all taxpayers itemize their deductions. And itemizing deductions means you keep track of things like medical expenses, your state income taxes are deductible, your property tax bill, your mortgage interest, your charitable donations, all of your miscellaneous expenses like paying your investment advisor or paying a tax preparer, all those things you keep track of, and you have to send it into your tax preparer for all these itemized deductions. Well, they're basically going to be changing the rules, making it so that all of that's going to be a moot point and you won't have to keep track of it, most of you. 95% of all taxpayers after this is done won't have to keep track of their itemized deductions anymore. And the reason for that is, so I just went through this, is that when you don't have itemized deductions, you're no longer getting a deduction for your mortgage interest. Because right now you do. If you itemize, you have mortgage interest, it comes off of your income. You'll no longer have itemized a deduction for charitable donations. So when you make that donation to that charity and they say, you know, give us $100, it's tax deductible, is always the next line. Well, if this change in the law happens, we're not going to have that conversation with our charities anymore, because they're going to say, well, we don't have any idea if it's deductible for you. It probably isn't, so let's not talk about it. Let's just say give because you want to give. And if you think about it that way, it should be the primary reason you're giving anyway, is because you want to give. No property taxes are deductible for people who aren't itemizing. So your property tax bill, you know, that's in the real estate industry, that's one selling point. You know, take out a mortgage, it's deductible. Your property tax is deductible. It's a way of kind of talking down the overall cost of ownership. That's gone. State income taxes are deductible. That won't be available for you because you're not itemizing. Medical expenses, forget it. Miscellaneous expenses, forget it. For most of America, we won't have to think about those things. What do you get in exchange for this? So all those things are things you're like, oh my gosh, they're taking all these deductions away from me. Well, what's the trick? Well, the trick is that they're going to give you a bigger standard deduction. They're just going to say, by the way, if you weren't itemizing, it's because you didn't have enough of those to add up to be bigger than the standard deduction that currently exists. So you are a standard deduction person, as opposed to an itemized. More of us are going to be standard deduction people. And the standard deduction is going to go from $12,000, let's just round it, for a married couple, to something closer to $24,000 or $30,000. Here's one of the differences between the Ryan plan and the Trump plan. Ryan said 24. I say Ryan, it's the House Republicans, but Ryan wrote it with, of course, his staff, probably largely. 24,000, Trump said 30. Single people, $6,000 standard deduction now goes to 12 or 15, depending on which plan wins out. So this is a way of saying, don't keep track of all those deductible expenses. Let's just give you a bigger standard deduction and we'll just call it even. Well, it isn't even. I can tell you, for people, I know specific people, I look actually at one of them in the mirror every morning, there will actually be not an even Steven trade here for a person like me, okay? So it's going to come out in the wash. Some people will benefit, some people won't benefit from that. What will be a fact is that our lives will be simpler if these plans come to fruition, because you won't have to keep track of them, okay? Who is going to still itemize? Well, some people will, because you have to now leap over your itemized deductions. There are very few of them. They'll have to leap over the higher standard deduction level. You follow what I'm saying? If you have some deductions that are bigger, you'll get to be an itemized deduction person. And those people are going to be people with big, big mortgages, so they have really high interest payments for their mortgages. And or they're going to have a big heart by giving lots of money to charities. I mean, you're going to have mortgage interest and charitable donations that actually exceed $30,000. So we're talking about some pretty big mortgages or some pretty big generosity. And those are the people who are going to still itemize. So for a lot of charities, if you think about it, that conversation of deductibility of a charitable donation is still going to be part of their conversation, but it will only be with the largest donors. It won't be with the rank and file donors giving $50 and $100 and $150. It will be for people giving large $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 and beyond type donations. Then we're talking about deductible expenses. And remember, all of this matters only if you have larger than the standard deduction. You'll be dealing with keeping track of it. But you're keeping track of very few things now. What's my mortgage interest? And what are my charitable donations? And does it get bigger than $24,000 or $30,000 if you're a married couple? Okay, so I'm going to close it out with some things to consider. In light of all of this, I think this is going to make sense to you. I'll try to explain it a little bit better. If you itemize currently, or you're pretty close to itemizing, meaning that you're right up against the edge of whether you're itemizing or not, okay? There's one thing I'm going to get off right off the top of the thing, has nothing to do with itemizing on your return, is that if you're living in that 15% bracket, and I'm going to go back really quick and I'm going to show it to you. Way back. probably a big mistake. But if you were living somewhere in this range of income or below, and you were once going to have a 0% capital gain on realizing gains, next year, if you sell that same exact investment, you may actually, if they implement it on January 1st, you'll actually pay tax. So what my first tip on this thing was to say that if you have some realized gains that you can take, and you live inside that 15% tax bracket where the world says 0% for long-term capital gains, think about taking them, okay? Because you're not going to get that chance again if they pass the law and make it effective January 1st. Now, these things are all about itemizing. Pay your property tax bill that you're going to have to pay in the winter, pay it in December. Why? Because now it's going to show up on your tax return as an itemized deduction. If this law changes and you're no longer going to be an itemized deduction person, you're going to be a standard deduction person, your property tax bill is not going to be deductible. You're still going to get the standard deduction. It's going to be bigger, but your property tax bill, if you pay it now, will count in your 2016 tax return as a deduction. There's no law that says you have to wait around till February 15th or whatever the date is, February 28th to pay it. You can pay it early. And I will say this to people just in case someone is listening or is here and just takes my advice and runs with it completely without talking to a tax preparer, is that if you happen to live inside the alternative minimum tax world, the AMT, be careful about some of these things, because if you're in the AMT, property taxes weren't going to be deductible anyway. So don't run around and pay them when they weren't going to be deductible. So if you're in the AMT, you should know it. Look at your tax return and find out before you do anything, okay? Next thing you can do is you could actually pay your January mortgage payment in December. Some of you have a mortgage that's scheduled. You know, it might be a little more difficult to change the schedule, but I think you can call your bank and say, please pay that in 2016. Why? Because part of your mortgage payment is interest, varying amounts, but that interest will now count in 2016 and it becomes a deductible expense. You're paying it early. So that's one trick of saying, okay, it's almost like making like an IRA, you make an IRA contribution to get a tax deduction. Well, you can make your property tax payment as well as your mortgage payment just a few days early and you can get a deduction for it. You might lose that ability next year. Paying an estimated state income tax. So for some people, they have to pay estimated payments every quarter. And that's not all types of taxpayers. Some people have a job where the money's been withheld and everything's fine. But other people pay their quarterly taxes on a quarterly schedule. You can pay your state income tax estimate in December, not waiting around till January. It's something that you can then put on your tax return as a payment for state income taxes, which is a deductible expense in 2016. This is the last thing, and I'm going to make it relatively quick, but it's a really important one, is you could accelerate your charitable donations. Remember, next year, if this law comes and is put into place, charitable donations won't be deductible for you because you're in the standard deduction world when you're not now. If you make charitable donations that you were planning on making next year this year, that's just plain old smart. You'll get a deduction for it. There's another trick, and it's a little more complex, but really not that complex, in my opinion. You could open up what's called a donor-advised fund. And I have experience with this in the last few weeks because it's something that I sent out to my clients to say, okay, there is a possible change that's happening. You may, if you're a known planned giver, if you look at your tax returns over the years and you give away a few $1,000s a year or $5,000 a year or $10,000 a year, and it's pretty consistent. You know who you're giving money to. It's not going to change in the near-term future. You can actually open up a donor-advised fund right now, and you can contribute money that you were planning on giving in future years, and you can load it all up in this donor-advised fund, and you can use that fund in those future years to pay out your donations to your institutions that you want to support. You get the tax deduction all in 2016. So to wait around and give money in 2017 and 18 and 19, now it's not deductible. If you loaded them all up into 2016 in a donor-advised fund, you get a big tax deduction in this year that you're allowed to get it. Those donor-advised funds used to be a tool that, the really wealthy would utilize. It's complex to set up, the administration. Well, not anymore. You can go to Schwab, you can go to Fidelity, you can go to Vanguard, you can open up a donor-advised fund in a day. You can load money up into it very, very quickly. Just transfer money from one account to that account. It's now a serious donation. You've made it into the donor-advised fund, and now you have total control. You send in a grant request, they call it, where you actually say, I want this to go to my 501c3 tax-exempt church. I was going to give money to them anyway. You send in the grant request, a Charles Schwab or a Vanguard sends out the money, a check, in the name of Vanguard or Charles Schwab, and they send an accompanying letter that said it came from the Jane Doe Donor Advised Fund, or whatever you call it. And that money then finds its way to the organization and does what it was intended to do. You got your tax deduction all in 2016. So a donor advised fund is still, it's not too late to consider this and to consider all of these steps in preparation for what could very well be a retroactive tax law change to January 1st, which nobody knows if it's going to happen for sure at all. But what I can tell you is you don't win the White House, the Senate, develop plans, have the mandate to do it according to an election, and then just sit on it and let it die. You implement it. And so I think that they've got the legislative tools to be able to do that, even with some opposition party. They still have the ability to actually pass it. So I think that retroactive to January 1st is a reasonable assumption, and it's a conservative assumption for you to plan around. So I have just a couple minutes, and I'm going to take just 2 minutes to talk about, I'm a financial analyst, so I'm a total geek about stuff like this, and I thought maybe you guys would be interested in what this actually means in terms of the government. If we took all of these changes that I just described and we said all the tax rate changes, lowering the tax rate from 39.6 to 33 and 38, 35 to 33, and the capital gains tax rate doing what we're doing, it would be over the next 10 years about an $8 trillion hole of revenue. So the tax receipts would drop by $8 trillion. But because of what's called dynamic modeling, which is what the House Republicans have pushed, a lot of the third-party kind of watchdog financial groups that Congress has to go through, called like the Congressional Budget Office, things like that actually analyze changes, they actually are they're going to do what's called dynamic scoring, which will say, hey, you know what, we're not just going to change the tax rates, we're not just going to change the rules, we also want to project forward what will happen to the economy. Because, if you grow the economy, then people make more money, and if people make more money, then we're going to tax them. And if we tax this growing economy, we'll actually bring in additional taxes. So when you look at what's been analyzed by the Tax Foundation, they actually see growth in the economy filling back up $2.5 trillion over the next 10 years from the economic growth that these changes will supposedly spur. In addition to that, things like losing your personal exemptions, going to a standard deduction, eliminating the mortgage interest, eliminating property tax deductions, and all of that, they call those base broadeners. They're things that actually make it so that there's more of your income that's getting taxed, even if it's at a lower rate. And they use that to fill up the rest of it. So the modeling that they're saying is that this is going to be neutral to the budget. These are based on models and based on projections. We don't really know what's going to happen, but this is something that I think as a well-read person you're going to hear more about in the coming months. Dynamic scoring. Listen out for it, because it's going to be one of the main ways that they sell this to Congress. And because they really care about deficits, but they really also care about growth. And they care about tax cuts, and it's hard to reconcile all of those competing forces. This is how they're going to do it, through dynamic scoring. Okay, so that wraps it up. I will say that I want to thank again the library for allowing us to have this wonderful space. The Senior Center Network is a great, great place for the community. If you ever get a chance to go over there, you should. And lastly, Up North Media for allowing us to broadcast this on their station. So thank you very much for coming. And now I'm going to open it up for questions.